Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the final session of the day. Great, thank you. It's really been a terrific day. I hope that you've all had really interesting and insightful discussions in each of your state-based days. We've got a session now coming together as a national program, and I'm really looking forward to the discussions. My name's Bryony Rogers. I'm the Chief Research Officer of the CRC, an academic at Monash, and the Director of the Monash Sustainable Development Institute's Water Program. I'd like to start by acknowledging that we're all meeting on lands owned and cared for by traditional custodians across Australia, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I myself am on beautiful Boonwurrung country in the southeast of Melbourne, and I also acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders joining us today and pay my respects to your elders past, present and emerging. So here we are at the final conference of the CRC after 9 incredible years of vision, research, innovation, collaboration. And at the beginning, we set out to create evidence and insights, tools and know-how for changing the way we shape our cities and their water environments. So the question for ourselves, have we achieved our mission? Have we proved the concept of water-sensitive cities? Have we demonstrated a compelling business case? Do we know how to implement water-sensitive cities on the ground? Have we got the tools to help us mainstream their delivery? And if we can answer yes to the above, what's next? To answer these questions, a number of the CRC's researchers and industry partners have been working together on what we've been calling integrated case studies. Our idea was to choose a handful of cases to which we would apply the suite of tools that have been developed through the CRC. This would give us an integrated place-based picture of vision, transition, community values, economics, integrated planning, infill development, and key technical and design issues. We hope that through this initiative, we'd develop evidence and insight into the holistic water-sensitive cities transition journey that's needed for places with their different opportunities and their different challenges. It would also give us valuable practical experience in applying the CRC's tools in an integrated way so that we can in turn provide guidance to industry on how to make the best use of the tools that have been developed to answer the different sorts of questions they have as they move from vision to implementation. So in this session, we're really excited to share with you a snapshot of the insights from these integrated case studies. We have Salisbury in Adelaide, Norman Creek in Brisbane, Townsville in tropical Queensland, and Knutsford in Perth, all different geographic contexts, different cultural contexts, and different development contexts. The format of the session will be a series of short presentations on the integrated case studies, followed by a panel discussion where there'll be opportunity for you to contribute through questions. So please hold your questions until all the speakers have given their presentation. And I'm really looking forward to exploring some of the collective insights that have been gained across the different pieces of work. So our speakers are across the country, and we're going to be throwing to the different rooms for each person. So we will first be going to Brisbane, where Stephen Kenway will be sharing some insights. Steve is a Professor of Urban Water at the Advanced Water Management Centre at the University of Queensland and has been our project leader of IRP4. So over to you, Steve, in Brisbane.
Can you hear me okay? All good. Well, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here to talk about how water performance analysis can help inform the business case, because the business case, why would we, or how can we make it attractive for development of water-sensitive cities, was a cornerstone of IRP4, and the IRP4 project looked at a range of case studies. I definitely want to acknowledge the wide team across the 4 universities that contributed, our fantastic project steering committee that stuck with us the whole way through. And so in brief, I'd like to talk a little bit, very briefly, about what is performance analysis, how do we develop and apply this performance analysis in IRP4, and then shift on to what research was done and applied across the integrated case study. So I focus particularly on the Salisbury case study, mostly due to time, and then conclude about lessons learned. This project, the research questions really started with how can performance be defined, assessed and measured? What is the impact on hydrology, heat and livability? And how can we find best or optimal solutions? that was used to inform design tools, including processes for assessment and typologies for a design. So we sought to understand what housing or development typologies enable the best outcomes, what information is critical to solutions, and what technologies suit different typologies and scales. Initially, in our enthusiasm, we thought we could also tackle improved governance options and arrangements, so we partly got there, but also worked closely with IRP3 that looked at that more closely. I guess I just briefly wanted to re-articulate that much of our city growth is infill, and these case studies were in infill development where, interestingly, the centralised infrastructure, the decentralised solutions, the architectural design, the planning and local communities all intersect. We started our project at site scale, and at site scale we have tremendous evidence now about how damaging business as usual development is. In many cases like these examples in both Adelaide and Perth, the design is leading to almost 100% impervious surface, leading to more runoff, contributing to local flooding, whether it's in overland flow paths or regional flooding. That obviously impacts urban heat and loss of water security. The more we're exporting and pushing water out of our suburbs, the more drier and hotter they are, and obviously it doesn't do anything to support their cooling or their water futures. Really briefly, this project was the intersection of design typologies, water mass balance informing performance indicators, and the cornerstone of it was a performance evaluation framework which connected design variables on the left-hand side via performance indicators to criteria. I realise this has been a very fast presentation so far because we covered it in detail with the group here in Brisbane earlier this morning, and I want to move on to the key lessons. So when we apply that, the evaluation has... we applied that in two different case studies and a partial application in Norman Creek in Queensland. So we began in Salisbury in South Australia, where there's lower socioeconomic. I think it was in the 10th percentile most disadvantaged community. There was optimising the value of available water, where there's a large existing recirculated stormwater facility, and they're looking at green corridors for connectivity. We also looked at very much a higher socio-economic development area close to Fremantle, close to the coast in Knutsford, Western Australia, which was a greyfield urban renewal, much higher density, more apartment story, higher apartment buildings, and looking at much greater technology for non-potable water recycling, including sewer mining. The Norman Creek, as mentioned, was more in a subtropical climate, much more focused on overland flow and flooding, which was only a partial case study. The role of the case studies had a central part in IRP4's change management framework, and I'm sorry I won't run through this in detail other than that we had a number of issues, including the problems of centralised water supply and changes to the natural hydrology, and the case studies informed both the typologies, how to design for those particular locations, and how do we demonstrate them as cornerstones of success. So acknowledging the architectural team, particularly from Monash and University of Melbourne, in Salisbury, and together with the City of Salisbury, we looked at the existing case, the business as usual case, where the population was expected to grow from 1,900 people to 5,000 people. We also looked at a water-sensitive future case, which had 5,000 people, and then a water-sensitive max, which had 11,000 people, So in this slide, you can see that the number of dwellings would increase from the existing case just under 1,000 to a water-sensitive max close to 4,000. Those sorts of changes had significant impacts on impervious surface. So in the existing case, 41% of the area was deemed impervious under business as usual through to the 5,000 infill. That would shift from 41 to 52. Under water-sensitive conservative, the total impervious surface would be 42%, and water-sensitive max, again with 11,000 people, that was drawn back to 41%. We could look in detail at land use changes associated with that. How much was parks and green space, street corridors, vacant land, etc. And business as usual is essentially displacing 35 hectares of vacant commercial residential land. Both the water-sensitive infill and the water-sensitive max had more green space, more parks, and large amounts of permeable paving for internal roads to also help water get more into the landscape. So in brief, across all the case studies, or particularly Salisbury and Knutsford, we could show that water-sensitive development had less stormwater runoff. So the reference state for Salisbury was that in the existing case, some 42% of rainfall is being converted to stormwater. Under the business as usual case, that would shift to 50%. Water-sensitive conservative would drop that between 31 and 39%, depending how much rainwater and stormwater harvesting was occurring. And under the water-sensitive max, full development with 11,000 people, that percentage of stormwater runoff could drop as low as 16%. And they'd be more self-sufficient. So here we look at the water self-sufficiency because we're using a mass balance framework. We can look at how much water is harvested internally versus relying on the centralised external system. So in the business as usual case and the existing case, there was zero harvesting of water internally. Under the water sensitive and conservative, again, largely through rainwater and stormwater harvesting, that was increasing to 20 to 25% of self-sufficiency or local internal supply, and under water-sensitive max to just over 30% of the local water being supplied. I'm just, in the interest of time, and just going to skip over, but wanted to make the point that water storage capacity is particularly important. The Salisbury example was perhaps a little bit unique because it did have a large underground aquifer storage, but importantly, we looked at storage including soil moisture, rainwater tanks, above-ground stormwater stores and aquifer stores. And so the role of storage in enabling a water-sensitive city is a story that I don't think has been widely told, but we need to talk about it more. For both developments, we represent the performance as these web diagrams, with the outer boundary being high performance, and progressively, the closer you get to the centre, poor performance. And so the existing case is EX and business as usual BAU. At the outer boundary, water sensitive, which when we look across the indicators chosen for this diagram, but in part of the framework, it's intended to be horses for courses. What indicators you choose for a site needs to be driven by the local issues which are occurring at that site. So in this particular site, they're interested in the storage capacity, the precipitation fraction not converted to runoff, the number of people supported per kilolitre of imported water. So we're using the term imported water for water brought into that precinct, as opposed to locally sourced, and the water supply self-sufficiency. I won't run through that in detail, again, just in the interest of time, but we can compare that to Knutsford, again, based on the detailed water balance, which had a larger sewer mining, and perhaps that was also a slight novelty, and it had access to quite a reliable sewerage source, which could be tapped to provide a large supply. So they're examples. I guess I go to the messages and the learnings and the conclusions. We concluded from this project that our cities are not currently well designed from the perspective of water. They're hydrologically wasteful, and that waste is damaging. Current infill development practice has significant adverse effects on urban water performance and thermal comfort, largely because of loss of water, green space and evapotranspiration. Water-sensitive design can simultaneously enable densification, i.e. accommodate more residents, retain or improve natural hydrology, and create more livable built forms. That's got to be a better business return for everyone if it's taken on the long term. Systematic performance assessment across the natural plus piped, the centralised and decentralised systems quantifies impacts, enables full costing for the business case. Much of the influence of cities on stormwater and cooling can be addressed with good building design and land use and vegetation management. The last three messages, that principles and key factors to guide that site and precinct level design are emerging, and obviously they need to be enabled in the regulatory frameworks as well and valued. And site context, climate, soil, slope, position are very important, and the actual designs or the typologies can perform very differently in different environments. Technology plays a key role, particularly for managing increases in centralised flow. So if you're increasing the population by 600%, that's a huge inflow of additional centralised water and wastewater. So recycling and efficiency and other technologies play a critical role in enabling that. Water service and hybrid solutions are critical for those additional water supplies to enable the growing populations and make local contributions to local supply and to water security, while minimising adverse hydrological impacts like downstream flooding. multidisciplinary, and I guess the last one, perhaps my favourite from an integrated project, multidisciplinary collaboration and language across planning, architects, engineers, social and economic scientists, ecologists and physical scientists, including microclimate, all play a role in designing and enabling water-sensitive cities. The publications are all available on the website now, with the exception of the final report, which will be up there, we hope, within the next couple of weeks. Thank you very much.
I will throw now straight to our on-screen speaker, Professor Nigel Bertram. Nigel is a Professor of Architecture at Monash University and the Director of NMBW Architecture Studio, who will continue telling you a little bit more about the work that sat behind the integrated case studies analysis.
Thanks, Bryony. Thanks very much, and Steve. Now, I hope this is all working and you can hear me. Just to talk briefly about some of the stuff that sits behind what Steve presented in the analysis of an infill precinct. I thought I'd go over what our criteria and techniques were for optimising spatial and livability outcomes that are in the end the main aim, to provide a place that is great to live and also works well. So when I change the slide, can you see that?
All good, Nigel.
Great, thank you. So the Infill Typologies Catalogue, which is one of the publications that Steve just flashed up, it takes an approach to a kind of kit of parts of an infill precinct. And importantly, it's looking at both the buildings and the spaces between the buildings as being of equal importance in terms of their performance. And similarly, it's looking holistically at both the public realm and the private realm as being working together in mutually beneficial ways to create a high performance and high amenity overall environment. So that, I say that because it's not actually very common in the way cities are managed and developed. Often these separate components, private and public, building and landscape, are executed by different people. The Typologies Catalogue takes a series of different known examples, actual designs that exist in the world that have been built or developed to a high level of resolution, and understands them in terms of real dimensions and their physical attributes. It starts not from an abstract idea about massing or volume or plot ratio, but through an idea of lived use and rooms. How do we occupy the buildings within inside, and how do those interior spaces relate directly to outside? So this is a very simple example, one of about 50 in the Typologies catalogue, where it's a 3-bedroom house on a 180 square metre block in Adelaide, and it has 3 bedrooms, one of which can be used on the ground floor as a home office. It has simple stacked wet area surfaces. It has living spaces that are oriented north and directly face a large garden courtyard. And it has a car space, a covered garage that opens directly to a view of that courtyard. So it's a highly efficient, compact unit, but it's important that we understand that the shapes and square meters that we measure actually work. And then we can look at how that individual unit works together with others if it's repeated in a row of 3 or 4. What sort of space, what sort of negotiation is between the private and the public realm facing, and between the landscape space and the built space. And we know that one building doesn't overshadow the other, for example, and that courtyards are able to be properly used and support real trees. If we know that, we can then build up, through doing that multiple times with smaller and larger buildings, we can build up and apply those principles to the opportunities that exist on particular sites. This is one of the sites that we used as a main test bed in the Salisbury example. You can see here it's in a kind of fragmented, part agricultural, part suburban condition, which is typical of an infill situation. There's also local characteristics such as the river course and remnant olive groves, and importantly on the site there's large cypress trees and remnant fragments of olive. Now this is an example. Every site has its own particular attributes, history, culture, so on. In our design that we ended up with after multiple iterations, we managed to retain the olive groves and the large cypress trees, as well as adding space for new vegetation, establishing connections from the street network down to the river network, and had a yield of 69 dwellings. Now, the typologies catalogue enables us to distribute types in terms of their appropriate location with respect to view, address, not overshadowing neighbours, ensuring the amenity is balanced between the new buildings and existing neighbouring buildings, and between the generosity to the public realm and the generosity of spaces in the private dwelling. We compared that with business as usual. We took a typical suburban development from the area, which had a lower yield at 42 dwellings and didn't keep the trees, and it marched out pretty much what some of the examples that Steve was showing before. It's single story. And we also compared it to a hypothetical existing or old suburban case as at 15 dwellings. So you can see that the yield is really quite different for the three options. The water sensitive option looks at a range of between 2 and 3 story development, and it has importantly a mix of types. So a mix of small apartments, small townhouses, larger townhouses, etc. It places an equal emphasis on the open space and the built space, and tries to make the courtyards of the private realm reinforce the ecology and the open space network of the public realm. All that site was this site number 1 in grey in the middle, and it's important that what's in a water sensitive precinct approach, that actions on the individual site are connected into a bigger urban design framework that's coordinated. So here you can see we had the overall precinct, which had certain urban design hierarchies and aims, and that's bounded in the pink dotted line, where every action in the private realm is also reinforcing a bigger goal in terms of overall green space amenity, dwelling mix, and access connectivity of the public river network and so on. So in the end, the principles for creating water sensitive infill precincts that we came to in the final report, or if you like, the way of going about that spatially, is first of all at the site level, establish public realm connectivity and enhance its quality and amenity, retain significant remnant trees, local character and topography, and allow these elements to contribute to the overall site logic, as opposed to the one-size-fits-all tabula rasa approach. And at the building scale, include a range of building typologies that allow a mix of scale, height, household types, and the potential for work living. And consider spaces between buildings as multi-use public and semi-public areas, allowing circulation, solar access, privacy, safety, and delight. And you can see that what Steve had just shown is that in achieving all these aims, we can also show that this type of livable, well-designed suburb can also perform well hydrologically. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Nigel. Our next speaker is Chris Manning. Chris is the Coordinator of Sustainable Water and Waste Solutions at Townsville Water and Waste. Unfortunately, Chris can't be with us live, but he's pre-recorded his presentation for us, so we'll go to his video now.
Over the last few months. But before I go any further, I'd like to firstly acknowledge the traditional owners and the custodians of the land that I am sitting on here in Townsville, the Urbaqua and Bindal people. I pay their respects to their cultures, ancestors and their elders, past, present and all future generations. So, first of all, I'd like to talk about why we wanted to do this project and why water sensitive Townsville as a holistic concept as well. So key drivers for us biophysically up here in Townsville are We have droughts and flooding rains with a dry tropical climate. We have water security issues and poor soils. Obviously, there's some seasonality and climatic extremes and a changing climate long term as well, which we're all sort of struggling with. We're lucky enough to have the Great Barrier Reef on our doorstep, and of course we also have our local waterways and wetlands that we value too. Now, from a social perspective, our community has a high potable water demand. There is reasons for that, but I won't go into today. There's community expectations and values that are evolving and for a green or livable Townsville in a dry tropical climate. Economic development, livability, health resilience, housing stock types, etc. All probably fairly similar to expectations of communities around Australia. Institutionally, we have our own unique siloed water management functions, which once again is probably not unique. Institutionally, technically and operationally, there's silos there. Disconnect between the water servicing and land use planning, which we've also been working with the CRC on as well. It's a topic of another presentation in this conference too. There's obviously some path dependency and lock-in. There's infrastructure path dependency, but there's also institutional arrangements and culture that is on a pathway and is locked in as well. It's hard to shift. But most importantly in this context is a lack of organisational wide commitment to a water sensitive Townsville approach. So what did we think we could do to address that? And what we thought we needed to do was to develop a business case, or more particularly a value proposition, to help drive that commitment to the vision, and then create some enduring investment across the three pathways to create a water sensitive Townsville. So the way that we thought we'd do it is we utilise the tools that the CRC has developed now, the scenario tool and the Infuse economic assessment tool as well. So we created, with the help of the CRC and E2 design, we created a model for Townsville using in the scenario tool, and we're able to do water cycle assessments, urban heat assessments, as well as land surface temperature and air temperature assessments, and a whole swathe of lots of other indicators and assessments. I won't go into all the details. I'm sure that others will present on that, not least the researchers. But we utilise that tool basically. Then we utilise the Infuse tool as well to do the economic assessment and BCR arrangements. And unfortunately the box is obscured by my talking head, but essentially we had a BCR of 1.7 with the main benefits for us is potable water saving, not surprisingly, nitrogen reduction, which is helping the Great Barrier Reef, property values increase, and potable water savings in terms of rainwater tanks. Rainwater tanks were the biggest cost as well, and you can see the stacked columns both in the benefits and cost there on the left hand side too. So there was some insights and learnings from this journey that we've undertaken with the CRC. One of them was the usability and utility and applicability of the tools. I have to say the scenario tool is very, very useful in providing a platform for optioneering. It's not designed to be a detailed design modelling tool, but it really is great for setting a base case and then optioneering out a few different solutions and seeing what that gives you across all those indicators that we talked about before. Provides a justification, the metrics for justification for decision makers, as well as a basis for consultation with stakeholders, including the community. It enables informed discussions around community values and expectations in respect to the biophysical scenario tools. And then it also talks about, through the economic assessment tool, who pays, how much, and importantly when. Insights that come out of the tools that we found really useful. The opportunities in using this tool are to influencing our authorising environments. There's also opportunities in optioneering at a high level, some of the strategies that we might employ going forward, and giving a bit of a biophysical and economic assessment of that approach to then inform more detailed designs and detailed modelling efforts and things like that. And probably one of the biggest opportunities that comes out of it is the potential to develop some targets. And I've given a couple of examples, but it might be a % canopy cover across the city, might be a % impervious target across the city. But developing the target with the use of the scenario tool and the economic assessment gives you that the biophysical outcomes, benefits and values, but then also it also quantifies the economic cost benefit of it as well. And then the beauty of those canopies, of those types of targets, is they're easily interpretable by stakeholders like the development industry. And then a lot of the other benefits and things that we need to see in the background all drop out of some of those high-level targets as well. So this is an opportunity that we will probably explore down the track. There's obviously a little bit more work to be done in that space, but I just wanted to highlight some of the things that we've learned in this process and the opportunities we've identified that we could work on going forward. I think that's pretty much it from my perspective. I'd like to thank everyone for listening. I hope it was useful, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Thank you to Chris. Our next speaker is in Perth, Shelley Shepherd, the Director of Urbaqua and the Program Manager of New Waterways. Shelley will be telling us about the Knutsford case study. Over to the Perth conference room.
Thanks very much. Oh, this is going to be feedback. Thanks very much, Bryony. Hi, everybody in the room. Hi, everybody around the country. It's very exciting that we're able to be in so many rooms. But here I would like to acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people as the traditional custodians of the land on which we are meeting today, as their continuing culture is just incredible and has so much about water, which is why we're here. So I'll just start the slide. That delay is very odd to look at. Okay, so we're trying to showcase the tools and how all these tools go together that the CRC has developed, and there is a massive suite of tools. We've heard already from Steve and Nigel about elements of the tools, so I'll just fly through those. But these tools that we've applied to Knutsford, I need to acknowledge that this is not my work, I'm just sharing it. It is mostly the work of the CRC, but also a Development WA as a supportive partner, which is awesome. So the tools that were applied in Knutsford are the Infill Performance Evaluation Framework, looking at the 3 elements. So we were able to do the water performance, which you saw as Steve's part, the urban heat assessment, which I'm not sure has been presented yet, and again the architectural and urban space quality, which has also been presented by Nigel. And then we applied the BCA tool just to see how that would stack up. So with regards to Knutsford, I'm sure people have heard a lot about Knutsford at the conference at the moment. It is a 3-hectare parcel within a 23-hectare redevelopment area, and it is located about 1.5 k's from Fremantle. It is an aged industrial area, and it has a really solid vision for becoming a water-sensitive city as an exemplar place for design. So that's the vision for Knutsford, which drives the opportunity to test these tools and see how they work out. As you know, when you're testing anything, you need to have a baseline. So a business as usual development case was designed, fabricated, and basically it represents the type of development that's occurring pretty much across the country. They're really big development footprints, leaving only a small proportion of the site that's uncovered. We also tried to fit in the number of dwellings that you normally put in there with some landscape area and some tree cover, and you can see that 8% tree cover is about what developments are doing at the moment. Also worked out what the water demand was for the development. So in terms of water sensitive infill, what does it look like in Knutsford? And it was plumbing in some rainwater tanks and use for non-potable. There was also the opportunity to have a wastewater reuse system. In this instance, it was a small package treatment plant for sewer mining to supply that fit-for-purpose water for public open space and for irrigation of the streetscape. We also increased the amount of public open space in that development area just so that people had access to more POS, and also increased the canopy proportion up to 22%, which is a really, really big part of reducing the heat. And of course, the other policy platform that's being really pushed here in WA is this increased deep soil zones. So you've got places to plant trees within the individual lots. So the water sensitive built form that was assessed, there were 3 typologies. Nigel has spoken about a couple, but they are part of the the water sensitive infill typologies framework. And really what they do is they show you how the changes in urban form can accommodate water on the site, can accommodate the green areas. And the difference in these typologies that we've seen is that they have larger private open space areas and larger communal open space areas. So it's more spaces for the green to go in. There were a couple of scenarios that were tested. So you see in some of the presentation, water sensitive conservative, which is a certain number of dwellings, and then a maximised water sensitive development, which has just had extra levels on it. So you fit more people in on the same development footprint, but it was the same water sensitive urban design aspects. Steve, I think, showed you this. I think this is a great diagram because what it actually shows you is the range of design elements that you need to consider when you're doing urban form and how they actually influence hydrology, water use, greening, urban heat. And so when you are designing these sorts of areas, you can look at how maybe the change in pavement or the change in roof coverage will impact on the hydrology of the space. So the idea that we're considering these linkages as part of that design process, that iterative design process, will lead to better outcomes. So how did it perform? Definitely the water sensitive scenarios perform better than the business as usual. So what you've got on that graph there, hopefully I can see it, I can't, no, I can't read that from here, but that's okay. We've got the water sensitive solutions allowed the same level of infiltration. So infiltration is very important over here because we need to recharge our local hydrology. It is seen as an opportunity, but also critical to maintain our groundwater resources and the sustainability of those. So the water sensitive scenario were able to do that. Was also able to reduce the amount of runoff. So therefore that again goes into the ground, but it reduces the strain on existing drainage systems because we are in an infill precinct. So we did see that the water sensitive scenarios, both of them, do perform better than businesses as usual, which really does result in a much greater amount of stormwater runoff. So the urban heat assessment was also undertaken. So you can see on the slide there, there's the business as usual development. It's all pretty much red and orange. So it's hot. It was modelled during heat wave conditions, and the water sensitive scenario, you can see there's areas of cool. You can get a 2 to 4 degree reduction in heat, which, as you know, can be critical for the health of the population that live there. So the benefits that we saw in terms of the type of urban form or built form that really had an impact on the heat was the permeable surfaces. So the reduced site cover, so the smaller building footprint was a huge contributor to that reduced urban heat, as are of course trees and vegetation and irrigation. But the surprising thing, which I'm not quite sure if you can see in the smaller one, which is the difference between the 2 water sensitive scenarios. So one was a conservative approach with 3 stories, and the maximum one was higher, taller buildings. So a lot of that decrease in heat came actually from the shade from the buildings. So that's quite an interesting thing. Other part of the assessment was about architectural and urban space quality, and really very much represented by the quality of outdoor public open space, communal space and outdoor private space, and of course dwelling amenity and function. So the performance criteria assessment, it's a multi-criteria assessment, and a lot of the important criteria are around diversity, size, access, those sorts of things. The results demonstrated that 80% of the indicators for the water sensitive urban form were actually at that high level, whereas the business as usual case was much more in the low to medium level. So you're definitely seeing that increase in architectural and urban space quality. So the final tool that we applied was the BCA tool, and that is showing us, although there's a whole lot of red differences there, that the cost of constructing the water sensitive urban form is definitely higher. but it's actually mitigated by now that consideration of the benefits that the community gets. And although that table there is written as community costs, we see that there was some work that was done here by the Department of Planning, Lands and Heritage that demonstrated that for every new dwelling, there is an additional $1,460 per year of additional costs to the wider community for poor medium density. So that is seen as a benefit when we're applying it in terms of the results that we see for water sensitive. So the overall performance, so you've seen this diagram already, demonstrates, so the red line is actually the business as usual, and the green line is our water sensitive, and it demonstrates that we have really achieved some performance in terms of heat, in terms of water sustainability, and in terms of outdoor quality. And they're things that hopefully our community is really starting to really wish for. The BCA there that you can see, the 2.06 number for the residents and community is pretty good, but for a developer it's only on a 1.5. So therefore the business case is pretty hard. Well, it's not really hard, it's still positive, but it's not necessarily that number that would drive the development industry to do this. So I think the thing that we are seeing is that because the industry has to construct these and they're quite high cost, we noted the cost of the wastewater reuse system was $1 million. So the benefits from those are actually reaped by the residents and also by the wider community due to the reduced scheme water need. So we do see that although the numbers are still positive, there's definitely an argument for it. A lot of the benefits goes to the residents, which is still not a bad thing. There's a whole lot of awesome reports and I hope everybody has a read. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Shelley. Our final speaker before we get into the panel discussion is Chris Tanner in the Brisbane conference room. Chris is the Director of Bligh Tanner Consulting Engineers, an Adjunct Associate Professor at the Advanced Water Management Centre at University of Queensland and our Regional Manager for Queensland as well. Over to you, Chris.
Oh, good. I'm here. Hope everybody can hear. Thanks everybody here in Brisbane, and thanks to the wider audience across Australia. I'm going to flip through two case studies, in fact, where we've really worked hard on the integration across a whole lot of factors to see how well it stacks up to do water-sensitive cities. My apologies to anybody who was here yesterday in the Integrated Water and Land Use Planning workshop, because you will have seen some of this before. So the first piece of work is work that's been done by Brisbane City Council. They are very keen to understand what it means, what does a water-sensitive city mean for them in the context of infill. Brisbane, the very large increase in their population, and populations are increasing significantly here, is from infill development. They chose a study site at Norman Creek, it's 5 kilometres from the CBD, a range of housing types, and you've heard about some of that from Nigel, but significantly quite a chunk of that is what we'd call character housing, and so it basically can't be developed. It's a hilly area, it's subject to flooding from, backwater flooding from the river, as well as a whole bunch of overland flow problems. So plenty of challenges. Just throw up there, I'll call it a spatial block diagram of how the development could work. I'm not going to go into that, but essentially what the study did was to, kind of populate the study area with a Lego style kind of urban design that represented different ways of doing infill development, with those urban designs driven in much the same way we've heard about already in Knutsford and others, in a way that's more water sensitive, a way that provides for more open space and so on. So that was the urban design component. We looked at a whole lot of indicators in that, I'll go through those here. The first is, and we looked at that through the context of what's there now, what would happen if we just carried on under the current city plan, and what would happen if we adopted a water-sensitive approach. So interestingly, first up, under a business as usual, we get a big increase in population, but using the new designs generated by Nigel, we get an even bigger increase in sort of population carrying capacity or development yield under the water-sensitive cities scenario. So, maybe you don't actually need to go that far, but it sort of speaks to me about good design rather than perhaps I'll call it churn it out design, or just churn it out development, and enabling a bigger increase in development. So that's a good thing just in itself, and actually drives a number of outcomes when you start to look at the benefit cost analysis. Impervious cover starts at about 53 odd percent for now, goes up to about 64%, I think, is the figure, and then drops back to about 51%, something like that. So again, it's a good news. Despite this increased development yield, we're actually getting lower percentage impervious cover in a water-sensitive city. That drives many of the following outcomes. Urban thermal comfort index under a water-sensitive city shows a pretty dramatic improvement on business as usual. Runoff is significantly reduced, so that means less erosion in streams, less flooding downstream. It also means less pollutant load to the river, and really significantly for Brisbane to the bay, which our understanding is reaching a tipping point where mud is about to sort of trip over from the inner bay to the outer bay. And so it really is something that's very, very significant in terms of what we've got to manage. Flooded area is reduced in a water-sensitive city compared to business as usual. I think the figure's around about 5,000 square metres reduction. So that's, how many houses would that be? Probably about 5 or 10. It's enough to make it worthwhile just in itself, I reckon, especially if you happen to live in one of those. And the drinking water demand, despite that, really significant increase in development density and yield, which is, as we see there, 200%, the drinking water demand doesn't go up nearly as much as that. So, a whole bunch of good indicators there. When we start to look at the regional economic benefit, we did this work using the Infuse package and the non-monetary value tools. There's a positive regional economic impact. It's good for the community, it's good for urban utilities, it's good for Brisbane City Council, it's good for the property industry. They're all positive. It's not to say everybody's going to jump on that, because some of those win more than others, and that's always going to make it difficult to sort of take those changes through, particularly in the context we have here, where the council may drive the density stuff and the stormwater stuff, but you have a water utility that's looking after their own backyard vis-a-vis water and sewer. So bringing that together is clearly an important part of this sort of change equation that might be necessary to achieve these things. And there'll be plenty of other examples in there. And so we conclude, it's a good outcome. Wins on all the biophysical indicators, wins on the economic indicator. As I said yesterday, why wouldn't we do it? Now going to go to a completely different one, which is Yarrabilba, big greenfield development, 50,000 odd people over the next 30 odd years. I think build-out's predicted by about mid 2040s or something. Been fascinating to work with Lendlease, who are the developer here. They've got a really big agenda around a circular economy. I think the figure they have for their water demand as just one indicator is to reduce that to 50% of what it would normally be. So they've got a long way to go with that, but it speaks about a developer wanting to do stuff. And I know they're frustrated with some of the regulations and other hoops they're trying to jump through to get to those sort of targets. I won't go through all of those, that's not the purpose here. Unlike the work we did with Brisbane that was driven by a number of sort of relatively more detailed studies, this we did through a sort of a seminar series, a workshop approach, backed up by a bit of modelling. So that made it a little bit of fun. We called it the Happy Street Workshop Series, and Nathan, who's here from Tract, has put a great booklet together about that. We'll be releasing that soon to everybody, but it's a great sort of story of how a group working together, thinking in an integrated way, coming from different disciplines, can start to imagine different ways and better ways of doing things. We generated a whole lot of sketches about what a happy street, a water-sensitive city might look like in the Yarrabilba context, and then we applied different kinds of methods to bring about a water-sensitive cities. Some of those things being, with infill development, there's a shrinking of backyards. Well, let's focus on the front yard. Let's start thinking about mandating things like a big tree in the front yard. And so you start, if you're mandating things in people's front yards, you're starting to blur the boundary between public and private property. Water harvesting, reduced building footprint, and all those sorts of things. A whole bunch of just good, solid urban design and architecture design thinking. Obviously, there's a come from Nigel. It's and we've got it all the way through this Happy Street series. Some good outcomes: reduced stormwater runoff, reduced water demand, increased evapotranspiration, reduced wastewater. Everything about this is better, at least from a water-sensitive cities perspective. And then when we start looking at the economics, again, done this through Infuse, through the economics framework, we've used the non-monetary value tool. We get a benefit cost ratio 1.59. I'd probably say, well, 1.6 might be enough significant figures. But again, why wouldn't you do this? When you start to look through here, the different the different benefits, you sort of start to pick up on why. We don't at the moment in our decision making. Whilst we might individually say, well, reduced morbidity, reduced mortality is a good idea, that's not measured when we make development decisions, by and large, except through a sort of a developer thinking it might be a good idea. If Logan Water going through their Queensland competition process, Queensland competition something, authority, thank you, Greg. There's no sort of lens to look at mortality, morbidity, increased value that goes to houses from nice green verges, green-blue infrastructure. So, that starts to give us clues as to why, despite the good outcomes and the positive economic outcomes, getting this stuff going forward is hard. We need to start really thinking about how we change some of that thinking. So in summary, I think we can conclude from those two case studies, and I've very much gone through them at a high level. Nevertheless, water-sensitive cities' approach to infill and greenfield here in southeast Queensland has demonstrated positive outcomes. We just heard from Chris Manning that it's done the same up in North Queensland. Well, happy days. These approaches, however, are not coordinated and encouraged. Implementation is sketchy. You get a developer like Lendlease who wants to do things. They're having a go, but that's, only get some of the way, and then it's sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back oftentimes. We need to rethink the regulatory and policy settings to get this integrated approach going. It's just an absolute must. And, you know, like all of this work, it's still work in progress. We've done some work. We need to start scaling down. We need to look at it in place, you know, in the context of you know, if it's Yarrabilba, the Logan River, and they're receiving water quality and all the catchment issues around dispersive soils. If it's Brisbane, they've got, it's not Norman Creek, it's a whole city that with a huge amount of infill. How do you start to you know, see how that can be spread throughout, implemented and so on. So there's still a long way to go. The challenge is in front of us all. So thanks very much.
Thanks, Chris. Now we started late, so we're running a little bit over time, but we would like to still have about 10 minutes of panel discussion if you can hang on for a little bit longer. Technology, I hope it works in throwing to the different people in the different locations, but we'll see how we go. I'm going to start with a pretty simple question. What I've heard from the different case studies, we've got the tools that the CRC have developed have allowed the development of a vision and a narrative for why a water-sensitive city. We've got evidence to underpin the quantification and evaluation of costs and benefits, and we're starting to get this integrated understanding of how to actually implement water-sensitive solutions in place. When we hear the different BCR ratios, etc., across the different cases, they all sound positive. And so my simple question is, can we categorically say that the business case for a water sensitive stacks up? And if yes, is the answer more complex? I'm going to throw to Nigel initially on the screen.
Thanks, Bryony, but I had the same question. So I was going to ask, why is 1.49 for a developer not enough? It seems a lot more than one, but maybe I'm missing something. Or then, you know, what is the tipping point and what is the expectation of benefit to cost? I think we've heard quite similar comments from Chris and the Knutsford example. So maybe Shelley and Chris would be best placed to answer this.
That's so mean. The business as usual case assessment was done after the case for it had been already made. And Development WA over here are like our community developer, and they will definitely move forward with this stuff because the community is starting to ask for it, which is fantastic. I think a learning that we took away was that there is a premium that's paid now on water sensitive development, and so there is definitely a benefit for it. It might just be that it's some of the slightly harder things, such as the wastewater reuse system, which possibly takes time rather than money. So the conversation that we had over here was that our industry would be very happy to do some of these innovative things if they could be assured that it wasn't going to make the process longer, because it's the cost of the land holding and the time to get through the approvals that's required for some of these new things that is possibly their greatest risk. So there is definitely a willingness and a desire from the community perspective to do it, but I think that we still have a bit of those governance issues and process issues to address before it becomes mainstream.
Shelley, can I just repeat? Sorry, can I just repeat the question just to be very straightforward? Is 1.49 not enough, even though it sounds like it's more benefit than cost? Can we just have an understanding about that?
Look, I think the number thing is probably a bit of a hang-up, and I don't think the tool was ever meant to say a 1 is a yes and or under a 1 isn't. I think it's more a representation of now we can quantify those elements that weren't quantified previously, so that we can use that as that business case. So we can then go to senior development managers and go to the people who might, the banks, and say, look, you know, it's worth lending money, it's worth the investment in this because there will be a positive return. But I really don't think that we should get hung up on the number and it's a 1.49. I think, yes, there's a positive business case, and so let's take that forward. And I'm not an economist.
Thank you.
Chris Tanner, you're full of enthusiasm. Why aren't we doing this? The positive business case is there, so what's the problem? And if it's about the time that Shelley's just been talking about, what can we do to start de-risking the step that it seems to be needing to be taken from developers? Chris in Brisbane?
If we look across the... Stephen, yep. If we look across the case studies, City of Salisbury together with Salisbury Water, Land Corp of Western Australia and City of Townsville, they've got a very strong community and council-driven development component, and they're relatively unique, so they don't necessarily represent a commercial developer. And I think the point was made in the presentations that need to really unpack further bests and benefits and costs to whom. If all the cost is in one bucket and a proportion of the benefits there are harvested back into that bucket, that's different depending on whether it's a perspective of the council or the water authority or the developer or the community. And so I think, I guess, two critical points. Broadening the cost benefit until we know that it meets all stakeholders, not just the whole of community. I guess the whole of community is a very good place to start. If you can get that, then it's really just how to align those benefits. And I think, I agree, shouldn't get hung up on the numbers. I think a much larger benefit cost ratios are potentially there under scenarios of climate change, which haven't really come through very strongly in our dialogue. The future heat that we expect, the future security, etc. And so from a precautionary principle, if we add some value in for that as well, I think it would stack up further. But I do think, as others have said, really need to have the private sector saying, yes, it stacks up rather than the CRC.
And I might just add to that, picking up on what Stephen's just said about the private sector. One of the things that Brisbane wants to do is, we will do in roughly a month, is we're running a workshop which will include the development sector to start testing out these ideas, because they're clearly, an absolutely vital group to have on board. But we need to take it further. We've got to address this question across all the different players about who benefits and who pays, and how we start to sort of broker that so it's equitable. I don't know how many of you remember Wayne's presentation, and one of the strategies there was equitable sharing of benefits and costs.
So one final question then before we wrap up. How do we use the insights that have come through these case studies and then other applications of the tools that start to give us this quantification and evidence base? How can we start using them to influence the authorising environment and to start to change the dial on some of these policy and regulatory settings that are meaning that it's still a big step to take for developers or councils?
We've just had a comment from the room here, maintain the rage. I won't tell you who it came from.
Maintain the rage. Any other elaboration?
I feel, Bryony, like we need to find ways of... need to find ways of incentivising this kind of development, or this kind of approach to city making and living. So it probably does require, as I think Chris Tanner mentioned before, like the policy settings need to be really re-looked at in the light of this evidence, because with the planning system the way it is, there really aren't a lot of pressures to incentivise or properly enforce this kind of development behaviour, because it's too easy to do business as usual. That's why it's business as usual. So I think there really is a political game to be sort of entered into, where this evidence needs to be presented to try to argue to change some policy settings, and it's very difficult, of course.
I wonder if there's also opportunity to be linking back to Billy Giles Cortai's presentation this morning, looking at the indicators that speak to a whole range of whole of society objectives and goals, and starting to link the business case to some of those integrated outcomes and use that to inform the target setting and the investment decisions, etc. Look, we have reached the end of... Oh, Shelley? Yep. Quick comment from Shelley.
We can end if you want, but I was just going to comment on, here in WA we had a presentation about community messaging, and it was quite strong that the community likes the numbers, they like those killer facts. So if we can start to use some of those numbers and just a couple of the really visualizations that the tools can give on the benefits of these things, that can then hopefully inform the community better. Because I know, yes, we need planning to do it, we need the authorising environment, but unless the community asks for it, the industry is not going to deliver it either. So if we can make the community a little bit more knowledgeable about the benefits and give them some of those killer facts that come out of these tools, then I think that might help a little bit.
Just a more serious comment rather than maintain the rage. What I was going to suggest is, the CRC has demonstrated the community benefit is greater than one. So really, to make it a go is the authorities that it's governments that actually assess, look at what's best for the community. So the next step is to then recognise that and give incentives to developers. If you are greater than one, you'll get approval quicker, and you can develop more densely. So suddenly there is an obvious value proposition, and that's what's going to make a difference. So I think the thing is to make sure we can convince the regulators and the governments it is +1, and if we've done that properly, then there should be compensating benefits, and if we do that, we'll see a lot more uptake.
Thanks very much, Nick. Look, I'm being given the signal. We have to wrap up now, but thank you very much to our panellists. Thank you for the behind-the-scenes teams that have worked on these integrated case studies as well. It's been a real collaborative effort across our researchers and industry partners involved in each of those cases. So a huge thank you there, and enjoy the rest of the conference. I'll throw to Jamie to wrap up the day now.
Thank you, Bryony, and thank you to those presenters who've just been in that integrated case study session. I agree with the early comment. It was great to be able to throw to different venues around Australia just to hear the different perspectives, and I like the idea of finishing on some killer facts. But anyway, that's content. Look, we've reached the end of the national session for today. Part of the way we've structured the conference was to allow today to be a focus on what the states are doing, but to make sure that we join together a couple of times, both for the keynote and for this integrated case study session. So as I said, that's the end of it for the national session. Some of these states are leaving us now. So in Melbourne, where I am, it's finishing up. But in, I think, Brisbane and in WA, there's still some workshops to go. So we'll keep this brief so you can have a break and then jump in. So that's pretty much it for today. We do have a full-packed agenda for tomorrow. We've got the first of our national webinars. We also have the closing session. You can sort of see here behind me the type of setup that we've got here. And I did want to sort of acknowledge that we had a few tech issues this morning with issues beyond our control. So thanks very much for those who stuck with us. Hopefully the day has been worth it. For those who've got the dinner tonight, please go along, enjoy yourself, relax. That's a very important part of the networking for the conference. Our board members will be along at a number of these dinners to help say thank you to the partners that have been supporting us for 9 years, and perhaps to thank some individuals as well. We still have our registrations open for training, which is on the Thursday. We'll be closing those tomorrow just so that the training providers know exactly who's coming along. But go to the Get Tickets button on the homepage and you can register there. And then, as I said, tomorrow we start the first of our webinar series. That starts in the afternoon Melbourne time, and we have our session led by Rob Skinner talking to some leaders about how we change the influencing environment and the politics. So that's it for me for today. That's it from the national program, and that's it from our national studio here in Melbourne. I'm going to close it off for those eastern states, and for those who are continuing, please enjoy the rest of the day. Thanks so much.